Riley Jackson had never imagined that a few metal shipping containers, stacked with care and framed in rustic timber, would become the epicenter of escalating neighborhood chaos. To him, they were simply functional, reclaimed materials thoughtfully converted into a modest, well-ventilated horse barn, a place of quiet discipline and honest labor. For nearly 2 decades, Riley had worked with troubled teenagers and veterans through equine therapy programs across the country, never staying too long in one place, always rotating between contracts and seasons. But this project was different. It was his. This parcel of leased land tucked behind the tree line, bordered by an old disused railroad track and a sleepy residential cluster, represented more than an idea or a job. It was, for the first time, a foothold, an attempt to create something lasting, something rooted. The land itself was unimpressive to outsiders. Uneven topography, old fencing, a shallow creek that dried out every August. But Riley saw it for what it could become. The modest barn housed 4 horses, rescues from a nearby rehabilitation program, each with their own quirks and scars. He designed the space with environmental consideration in mind. Solar panels salvaged from a failed warehouse installation, a filtered rainwater collection system, and even a passive airflow cooling channel inspired by ancient desert dwellings. It wasn't fancy, but it was efficient. He'd even paid out of pocket for a zoning review before finalizing the lease, a luxury he couldn't always afford in the past. The consultant had confirmed it clearly. The land fell under a mixed-use support classification, part of a broader patchwork of historical overlays and untouched bureaucratic categories that no longer matched modern development patterns. In other words, a gray zone. And Riley knew how to work within the gray without overstepping it. The issue began not with a formal complaint or a direct confrontation, but with a look. It came from across the creek one morning while Riley was unloading feed from his truck. A woman, trim, tightly postured, clutching a white ceramic mug like a prop, stood perfectly still at the edge of her deck, staring at the barn. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply observed, with the clinical detachment of someone taking inventory. See, her house was a modern craftsman-style build, all faux stone facades and curated landscaping, part of the newer development that had swallowed what remained of the original farms in the area. Riley had noticed it before, but paid little attention. Now, the attention was reversed. He asked the property owner, a semi-retired landscape architect named Gene, if he'd ever heard complaints from that direction. Gene just chuckled and said, "If you mean Karen Levington, no. But that doesn't mean she's not complaining somewhere else." Gene had leased the land to Riley on a handshake followed by formal paperwork, a rare gesture of trust that Riley appreciated. Gene had told him flatly, "I don't need to turn a profit on this, but I do need someone who won't make me regret trusting him. I've watched what you do with people and horses. Just don't bring drama, and I won't bring lawyers." Riley had kept that promise. He filed for insurance. He followed every local guideline. He made sure his fencing stayed within agreed limits, and he even installed a double-gate system for noise and security. Yet here was this woman, her silent scrutiny suggesting that something had already crossed a line, though he couldn't imagine what. It took another 10 days for the first official notice to arrive. A flat, overly sanitized letter from the zoning office stated that an anonymous report had been submitted regarding unpermitted agricultural activity and improper structure classification on the parcel Riley was using. It wasn't an order. It wasn't a citation. It was an invitation for inquiry, a bureaucratic warning shot. Riley knew the rhythm of this kind of language. It was careful, lawyer-approved, intentionally vague, and it could mean everything or nothing depending on how he responded. He brought the letter straight to Gene's door. Gene read it slowly, his brows knitting tighter with each sentence. "This is absurd. You're not even running a business here. There's no signage, no advertising, no high traffic, You're basically boarding rescue animals and breathing. Still, Jean sighed and offered a kind of resigned shrug. Let me talk to someone I know in planning. Meanwhile, don't touch anything. No expansions, no fences, no new paint. Bureaucrats smell movement. Riley thanked him and returned to the barn, irritation rising in his chest. He wasn't naive. He'd dealt with friction before, even harassment. But something about the methodical nature of this contact unsettled him. The complaint was obviously coordinated to look like a spontaneous concern, but someone had used the exact right language to trigger the review. That wasn't normal neighborly behavior. It was targeted. Over the next several days, he kept everything running as quietly as possible. He canceled 2 planned volunteer sessions and took down the program calendar from the tack room bulletin board. But on the 5th morning, he found a bright yellow flyer stapled to a wooden post just outside the barn. Unzoned livestock structure. Report filed. The flyer was printed on municipal template paper, though no department seal was visible. He didn't touch it. Instead, he took a photo and forwarded it to Jean. That evening, Jean showed up with a copy of the original survey document from 1972, showing the land's ambiguous use classification and a scan of the lease agreement, both of which had been filed with the county. "We're not doing anything illegal," Jean said, "but we might be pissing off someone who thinks they can outpaper us." Riley started digging, not in secret and not on conspiracy forums, but through proper channels. He found the archived zoning maps through the county's digital records office. That's when he stumbled on something odd. The parcel had been marked decades ago as part of an inactive civil support corridor, a term now obsolete but still occasionally referenced in land use overlays from the Cold War era. Most of those parcels had been rezoned or quietly absorbed into commercial plans, but this one, perhaps due to clerical neglect or its location, had never been reclassified. As a result, it existed in a strange administrative purgatory. Riley flagged the clause and forwarded it to a zoning consultant he found through a planning policy forum. She confirmed. Technically, this parcel could be registered under emergency civic logistics. No one ever does it, but it's in the books. You wouldn't be lying. A plan began to take shape in Riley's mind, not as retaliation, but as protection. If someone wanted to use obscure bureaucratic tactics to destabilize his work, then maybe it was time he used the same mechanisms to secure it. He would pivot, register the barn as a low-tier civilian logistics facility under dormant infrastructure code. The new status would shift oversight to a different branch, essentially shielding it from residential zoning complaints. It was legal. It was traceable. It was real. And it was far more difficult to challenge. When the official request was submitted 2 weeks later, through the proper forms notarized and referenced with historical documentation, he didn't broadcast it. He didn't brag. He just waited. Across the creek, Karen Levington continued to watch. But this time, Riley didn't flinch under her gaze. Riley's filing passed through the system with less resistance than he expected, though the silence that followed felt more ominous than reassuring. The application to reclassify the property as a logistics support facility for emergency civic redistribution was submitted with historical references, satellite diagrams, and the obscure but entirely valid municipal code that had not been repealed since the early 70s. It was bureaucratic sleight of hand, not trickery, but precision. Riley didn't invent anything. He simply found the forgotten rulebook and read it thoroughly. The approval came not with fanfare, but with a stamped document in the mail and a 2-line email from the planning office. Your application has been processed. Site reclassification updated. That was it. No calls, no follow-ups. Just a quiet shift in legal identity. And just like that, his horse barn, previously described in a vague, vulnerable tone as potentially unpermitted, now existed on paper as a contingency redistribution point. Effectively, a non-commercial civilian node for emergency use. It wasn't a lie. Riley knew what he was doing. He was protecting something simple from a system that made simplicity impossible. Yet even this strategic move didn't come without consequences. Because the moment the property's designation changed in the public record, a copy of the update was automatically added to the county's online zoning index, a page available to anyone who knew where to look. It took only 72 hours for the first knock to arrive at the gate. A woman, unfamiliar and wearing an ID badge on a retractable clip, stood beside a compact silver sedan with government plates. She introduced herself as Lillian Rowe, a regional assessor. She wasn't aggressive, but her questions carried the tone of someone reviewing a file that didn't make sense. She asked if she could walk the perimeter. Riley nodded and accompanied her. She never stepped inside the barn, never touched anything, and she didn't take photos. But she asked questions, polite, clinical, and unnerving in their specificity. How long had the horses been on site? What kind of materials were stored in the northern shed? Had any drills or logistical coordination exercises been conducted with local agencies? Riley answered calmly, sticking to the truth. He explained the barn's origin, the rehabilitated animals, the absence of formal business activity. He repeated that it was a low-impact, privately managed site with potential utility in emergency conditions, and that, no, he had never conducted any drills, nor claimed to house equipment beyond basic supplies and feed. Lillian never accused him of anything. She thanked him and left without incident, but the look in her eyes suggested that someone, somewhere, had flagged this property for reasons outside her control. That same evening, Jean forwarded Riley an email forwarded from a contact in county administration. It included an inquiry. Can you confirm the nature of the structure at parcel B49, and whether the lessee has authorization for any dual-purpose usage related to regional preparedness? No name attached. No signature. Just an internal query with enough weight behind it to get someone's attention. Jean responded with 3 attachments and a single sentence. The lessee is operating within the permitted bounds of his contract and county designation. But it was clear something had shifted. Karen's hand became visible not through direct action, but through her sudden absence. Where she once stood watching every morning, now her deck remained empty. No more passive stares, no more early morning presence across the creek. It felt calculated, like a phase had ended and a new one had begun. Riley didn't trust the quiet. The next complication arrived not as a legal notice or complaint, but as a message, an indirect warning masquerading as casual concern. A man, mid-40s, appeared at the front gate one afternoon, dressed in a button-down shirt with no insignia and a polite, non-authoritative demeanor. He claimed to be a community safety liaison, and he said he just wanted to check in on some of the logistical data the county had logged. Riley asked for identification. The man offered a generic business card with a private contractor's logo. Nothing official. Riley declined the meeting. The man didn't argue. He smiled, said he understood, and left with no visible frustration. Riley noted his license plate and wrote it down. That night, someone left a cardboard box just outside the gate. No markings, no address, no tape. Riley approached with caution. Inside were laminated flyers printed in bold red font. Do you know what's being built on parcel B49? Demand answers before it's too late. The language mimicked the tone of populist outrage, but the formatting was too sharp, too professional to be homemade. On the reverse side, a heavily distorted satellite image of the barn was overlaid with arrows, question marks, and ominous words like possible containment structure and unauthorized civilian zone. Riley didn't panic, but he didn't dismiss it either. He gathered the materials, logged them, and made a quiet call to a contact from his nonprofit days, a program director who had since transitioned to municipal risk mediation. She wasn't law enforcement, she wasn't zoning, but she knew people. When he described the situation, she grew quiet, then said, "You need to prepare for escalation. Not from government channels, from community perception. This isn't about legality anymore. Someone is going to try and paint you as a threat." She was right. Within 5 days, Riley received a request to attend a voluntary community discussion forum, hosted by a residential coalition on the other side of the creek. It was presented as an open invitation to collaboratively explore local land use transparency. Jean forwarded it to Riley with a single comment: "They're going soft before they go hard." Riley declined the invitation formally with a letter stating he was open to direct questions through appropriate channels, but would not attend meetings with no legal or civic standing. The forum proceeded without him. Videos surfaced days later of neighbors voicing concerns over secrecy and militaristic language in public zoning entries. Karen never appeared in the footage, but her phrasing echoed unmistakably through the voices of others. Then came the mail interruption. For 3 consecutive days, Riley's deliveries from the agricultural supplier failed to arrive. He called the dispatch center. They confirmed the driver was blocked from entering the parcel due to an ongoing administrative assessment flagged in the GPS system. It was a third-party update, likely based on new mapping data pushed through county systems. Riley knew what had happened. Someone had triggered a precautionary zoning overlay, a rare but legal mechanism used to flag properties with ambiguous designations. It wasn't punitive, but it effectively cut off routine services until resolved. Riley filed a formal appeal through the Planning Commission. It was reviewed and removed within a week, but the damage was psychological. Someone had learned how to exploit the same systems Riley had used to protect himself, and now they were weaponizing those systems against him. That night, Riley returned to the barn just after dusk to check on the perimeter fencing. He walked the property slowly, flashlight in hand, boots crunching on gravel, horses shifting behind him in their stalls. Near the northeast corner, behind the compost trough, he found a thin plastic tube partially buried in the dirt, an irrigation line that wasn't his. It had been snaked into the brush, the end capped, as if meant to simulate a buried line. At first, he thought it was just a leftover from previous land use, but further along, he spotted a second one, this time tagged with a barcode and short alphanumeric label. Manufactured recently, deliberately placed. No explanation. Riley didn't notify the police. He took photos, marked the coordinates, and sent everything to the same municipal mediator he'd spoken to before. Her response came fast. "They're building a narrative. Don't give them a reaction. Just keep documenting." So he did. He added logs. He time-stamped entries. He filed each item not as a complaint, but as evidence in case of escalation. He wasn't preparing for a fight. He was preparing to survive one without lifting a hand. But somewhere in the shadows of official processes and silent neighbors, the story was shifting. Riley no longer felt like a caretaker of animals. He felt like a placeholder, someone quietly surrounded, not with guns or noise, but with intent. And the barn, once a place of healing, now stood as a target with paperwork armor, just strong enough to delay whatever was coming next. The escalation did not begin with noise, confrontation, or any tangible act that Riley could point to as explicitly hostile. Instead, it unfolded through a gradual tightening of invisible threads. A subtle, relentless constriction around his daily operations. Each piece of pressure designed to feel minor in isolation, but cumulative in effect. It started with something small, the environmental compliance notice. A plain envelope arrived by standard mail, marked with the county seal and a notice to evaluate drainage systems for compliance with runoff standards. Riley knew immediately that this was not random. The property had been surveyed 6 months earlier, and no concerns had been raised. The letter didn't demand immediate action, but it required him to schedule an inspection within 30 days or face a $400 administrative fee. He wasn't worried about violations. His design included gravel filtration trenches and vegetation buffers. Still, the timing was no coincidence. Someone had found a lever and was starting to pull. 2 days after the letter arrived, one of the horses, an older gelding named Jasper, was spooked during a routine grooming session. Riley didn't notice anything at first, but as he examined the surrounding paddock, he discovered a small red laser pointer dot flicking intermittently across the fencing. It disappeared when he moved toward it, but the implication was clear. This wasn't some neighborhood prank. It was a targeted provocation, designed not to harm, but to unsettle. Riley didn't tell anyone. He added a second motion detector near the rear of the property, masked beneath a tool shed. It wasn't connected to an alarm. It simply logged activity. That night, the device triggered 3 times between 2 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. The gate had remained locked. No signs of entry, just movement, out of frame, and then silence. By the end of the week, more disruptions followed. The water supply line, drawn from a permitted well and regulated by the Agricultural Board, was mysteriously interrupted. Riley discovered that the control valve had been manually twisted to near closure. No one had broken in. No fences were cut. It was a simple act, but precise. Someone had entered through a side trail, timed their movement carefully, and tampered just enough to cause doubt. Riley restored the flow, but began logging daily photos of each valve setting, time-stamped and archived. He filed no police report. Not yet. His instincts told him that a report without a culprit or proof of intent would only mark him further. Instead, he contacted a hydrologist he'd worked with in Oregon during a similar land lease project and had him draft a basic waterline audit, official, dry, and formatted for state review. The goal wasn't to raise an alarm. The goal was to generate a paper trail. That strategy proved wise when, just days later, a notice was posted publicly on a local neighborhood forum accusing Riley of abusing private water infrastructure for commercial purposes. The claim was vague, full of implied wrongdoing, but no direct evidence. Riley didn't respond. He didn't issue denials or threats of legal action. Instead, he sent the waterline audit to the relevant regulatory board with a quiet cover letter. No violations observed. Preventive documentation enclosed for record-keeping. The forum post disappeared within 48 hours, but Riley knew what it signaled. Whoever was pulling the strings had now shifted into narrative control. This wasn't about zoning anymore. It was about building an image of a man operating in secret, manipulating rules, ignoring the neighborhood's will. Then came the mapping drone. Riley was in the pasture when he heard the buzz overhead. A small quadcopter drifted over the fence line and hovered for nearly 2 minutes before drifting away to the west. It wasn't illegal, not technically, but it wasn't neighborhood kids playing either. It was a professional-grade device, one with LiDAR scanning and infrared capacity. Riley recognized the model. He'd seen it used by fire departments for emergency response and by environmental surveyors for vegetation mapping. That same evening, he contacted a privacy law consultant he'd met during a prior land management course and asked for a summary of his aerial rights. The response came promptly. Unless the drone was interfering with animals or physically landing on his property, he had no recourse. But, the consultant added, you do have the right to report repeat flyovers to the FAA if they suggest pattern surveillance inconsistent with hobby use. It won't stop the first few flights, but it puts you in a protective category for future claims. Riley filed the report under a temporary FAA incident number and logged the drone model, time, and trajectory in his notes. While the digital presence was intensifying, so too were the whispers. He started hearing things from local suppliers, half-joking comments from delivery drivers and equipment vendors. "Hey, are you the guy running the missile barn?" one joked, laughing nervously. Another mentioned that someone in town was spreading rumors that Riley's horses were just cover for some kind of bunker construction. Even the feed store owner, who had always been supportive, looked at him sideways when he came in to restock supplies. The shift was unmistakable. He was no longer the horse guy. He was something undefined, something whispered about, something suspect. But the most definitive proof of escalation arrived in an envelope without a return address, slipped into his mailbox after hours. Inside was a single page. A satellite image of the barn, blown up and marked with Sharpie, circles, arrows, notes like irregular heat signature and entry point here. On the bottom, scrawled in pen, "You won't get away with this." Riley didn't. Panic. He scanned the letter, filed it digitally, and forwarded it to the same mediator he had worked with before. Her response was swift and serious. "Keep records. Don't engage. This has the marks of a soft campaign. They're trying to make you act erratically." She recommended a forensic mapping specialist, someone who could install unobtrusive surveillance, not cameras, but microsensors that logged vibration and proximity. It wasn't for defense. It was for credibility. Riley agreed. Within 3 days, the devices were installed, small enough to hide in fence posts, dirt mounds, and barn beams. They didn't trigger alarms. They didn't flash or make noise. They just watched, invisibly, and recorded movement. The night after installation, 2 readings came in from the eastern quadrant of the property. Movement. Human. Less than 100 feet from the stall windows. No breach. No damage. Just presence. Riley said nothing. He waited. The following day, he received another anonymous letter. This one handwritten, less polished but more direct. "You should leave while you can. There's more coming." That was the first night Riley slept with his boots beside the bed and a phone in hand. Not because he feared for his life, but because he now understood. This wasn't about a barn. It wasn't about zoning. It was about control. Someone, perhaps multiple people, had decided he didn't belong, not because of what he did, but because he had found a way to exist beyond the structures they understood. He wasn't breaking rules. He was using them in ways that weren't supposed to be available to someone like him, someone without institutional power, without political leverage, without social standing in the enclave across the creek. His offense wasn't criminal. It was architectural defiance. The final signal of this phase of escalation came not in a letter or drone or rumor, but in an official summons. A county compliance officer had requested a formal property review, citing unusual use categorization and overlapping designations. It wasn't an accusation. It was a scheduled meeting, and Riley would attend. But he wouldn't go alone. He would bring documentation, professional reports, audit logs, historical overlays, and independent assessments. And he would bring a witness, Gene, the landowner, who had already made it clear he wasn't intimidated by neighborhood politics. The message was simple. They could poke and prod all they liked, but Riley Jackson wasn't leaving. Not without process, not without proof, and not without making sure everything they did to move him would be on the record, because the game had changed. And if they wanted to escalate, so would he. But within the very system they had tried to weaponize against him. Quietly, precisely, without fear. The morning of the compliance inspection began without any visible sign of confrontation, but Riley could feel the pressure accumulating like static in the air. The property had been meticulously prepared in advance. Grass trimmed, feed containers labeled, water lines tagged, and every single component of the barn logged and cross-referenced with diagrams and legal definitions from the reclassification. Documentation. He didn't dress for battle. He dressed for bureaucracy, wearing a collared shirt and work boots still coated in dust, a combination that said plainly, "I respect the process, but I belong to the land, not to your offices. Jean arrived 20 minutes early, calm but observant, carrying a leather folder with notarized copies of the lease agreement, original land use permits, and 3 letters of character reference from local agricultural contacts. Neither of them spoke much while they waited, both knowing instinctively that when a process is weaponized, silence becomes your armor. When the compliance officer arrived, she didn't come alone. There were 2 of them, one woman from the zoning board and one man from the public land classification review panel, which was not common. They were courteous, procedural, and efficient. They moved slowly across the property, asking questions not because they expected a problem, but because someone had clearly prepared them to expect something unusual. Riley answered each query with quiet clarity, pointing not to assumptions but to documents. He walked them through the origin of the barn's materials, the frequency of feed deliveries, the nature of his equine therapy work, and the reclassification approval that had been processed without contest. When they asked about the emergency logistics designation, he provided them with printed policy notes from the county's 1974 Civic Continuity Plan, highlighting the clause that allowed for low-impact, non-commercial preparedness nodes to be integrated into agricultural infrastructure. They didn't argue. They took notes, and when they concluded, they offered a tight-lipped but unmistakable assessment. There are no violations at this time. All current classifications are supported by documentation. Any further review will need to be initiated through legal process. It should have been a victory. But Riley knew better. The law might be satisfied, but perception was not. The visit had been triggered not by legitimate complaint, but by the accumulation of pressure from coordinated whispers. The game wasn't about rules anymore. It was about wearing down resilience. The day after the inspection, Riley found tire tracks near the southern edge of the property, far from the gate, where no delivery trucks had reason to be. He followed them, not out of panic, but pattern recognition. They led to a gap in the underbrush where an old hunting trail intersected with a dry arroyo. It was legal land, unclaimed by any subdivision, but it provided a line of sight to the barn. He flagged the area and installed another sensor, not to catch anyone, but to confirm that eyes were watching, even when feet never crossed the line. That night, Jean called him with news. Someone had contacted him directly. Not a board member, not an administrator, but a private citizen claiming to represent a concerned collective of homeowners who wanted to open a dialogue about future land transitions. The tone was rehearsed, the language vague, and the caller refused to identify anyone else involved. Jean had hung up after 2 minutes, but he was visibly disturbed. "They're not asking anymore," he said. "They're probing for leverage." Riley nodded, the words confirming what he already suspected, that this wasn't just about discomfort or misunderstanding. This was about removing an outlier. Not because he was a threat, but because he disrupted a pattern of control that had grown unchecked for years. Still, Riley wasn't interested in drama. He wasn't there to win arguments or embarrass people. He was there to protect space, for the horses, for the soil, for the quiet work that had always mattered more than anyone realized. So he changed tactics. He reached out to the local fire marshal, not to file a complaint, but to request a routine safety walkthrough. He invited a regional vet to conduct a welfare audit on the animals. He even brought in a waste management consultant to review his manure composting setup. None of this was reactive. It was preemptive armor. It sent a message. This property was not a rogue operation. It was a fully documented, ethically maintained system, compliant on every front. He created a layer of insulation so dense with procedure that no lie could penetrate it without unraveling in sunlight. Then, unexpectedly, something shifted. One of the neighbors, an older man named Harold who lived closer to the creek but had never spoken directly to Riley, approached him at the gate while walking his dog. He didn't ask questions. He didn't voice concerns. He simply said, "I remember when this land was nothing but weeds and fire ants. "It looks good now. I don't know what she's trying to do, but some of us don't care. Some of us like that there's still something here that doesn't come in a brochure." Riley thanked him, and they shook hands. It wasn't an alliance. It was recognition, something stronger than defense. For the first time, Riley felt the presence of quiet support. That evening, Riley reviewed the compliance report again, looking for weaknesses. There were none. Everything was in order. But in the notes section, a small sentence caught his attention. "Subject has layered multiple legal statuses which, while not contradictory, are unusual in density for the size of property." It wasn't an accusation, but it was a signal. They didn't like that he had used the rules too well. They didn't like that he understood the architecture of process. They wanted simplicity, and Riley had made complexity visible. That was his real sin. Not deception, but defiance by knowledge. And then, just when the tension seemed to plateau, Karen reappeared. Not physically, not at the fence, but in the background of another neighbor's conversation. A new rumor circulated that Riley had applied for federal funding under emergency management grants. It was false, of course. He hadn't taken a single public dollar. But the detail was too specific to be random. Someone had looked into systems Riley hadn't even touched. They were digging not because they expected guilt, but because they needed a frame to fit around a picture they already hated. Riley made no counterclaim. He simply added a new section to his records: false narrative tracking. Because when you're dealing with informal campaigns, the only way to win is to make every lie traceable, every push visible, and every reaction deliberate. That week, Riley stood in the middle of the barn after feeding and looked at the structure differently. It was no longer just shelter, it was testimony. A declaration in steel and cedar and sweat that not everything built quietly is weak, and not every target is vulnerable. And though the escalation would no doubt continue, he was no longer bracing for collapse. He was anchoring himself for endurance. Because survival in these fights doesn't come from shouting the loudest or striking back first. It comes from knowing when to move, when to stay still, and how to keep building even as the storm gathers. The storm did not break suddenly. It thickened slowly, like a fog that crept in without sound, until Riley realized that every path he used was being narrowed, every step subject to friction so finely distributed that it escaped immediate notice. The first indication came in the form of an insurance audit, not from his own provider, but from the company that covered Gene's property. The insurer had received an anonymous tip regarding high-risk structural modifications inconsistent with declared use. Riley knew what this meant. Someone had gone through the insurer's public-facing channels, flagged the barn's reclassification status, and implied that it might house hazardous materials. The wording was careful. The implication was that of potential liability, not criminality. But it was enough to trigger an administrative review, and Gene, despite his loyalty, could not ignore it. He called Riley to explain, not angrily, but with frustration beneath his voice. "They're trying to make me choose between you and policy integrity," he said, "but I won't. I'll push back, but it might get loud." Riley met the insurance assessor 2 days later, walking him through the barn's interior with the same practiced thoroughness he had used with zoning. He showed him feed storage, ventilation flow, stable design, and the self-contained waste management system. The man took photos, made notes, asked questions that indicated he already knew the answers. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "Someone sent us a map with thermal overlays and a note suggesting this might be a camouflage facility for emergency equipment. I don't put stock in that, but I've got to log it." Riley didn't respond. He simply handed the man a copy of the previous compliance report, along with notarized documentation of the structure's materials. The assessor nodded, thanked him, and left. But Riley knew that even if the report came back clean, damage had already been done. Every institutional contact now carried the faint scent of suspicion. By the following week, Riley noticed a sudden drop in supply delivery reliability. Companies that had serviced his barn regularly began hesitating. Orders were delayed or rerouted without notice. When he followed up, they explained apologetically that someone had called claiming to represent a regulatory agency, suggesting that his location was under investigation and that deliveries could become part of a compliance entanglement. The calls, of course, were false, but the uncertainty they sowed was real. Businesses don't care about truth. They care about liability. Riley tried to stabilize the situation by sending out preemptive notices to his vendors, explaining the reclassification, providing documentation, and reassuring them that no legal action or restriction existed. Most of them responded supportively. A few quietly dropped him anyway. It wasn't personal, it was risk management. And then came the strategic incursion, not physical, but social. A new group appeared online calling themselves the Creekstead Advocates. Their stated purpose was preserving the character and safety of our residential ecosystem. Their language was sanitized, curated for optics, but anyone with a sense for subtext could read the real message. Their website, hastily constructed but impressively polished, contained no direct accusations, only questions. Did you know our community borders a facility registered for emergency logistics without public consultation? Do you understand the implications of infrastructural ambiguity on your home insurance? Who defines preparedness? And should it include horses, containers, and off-grid installations? The group didn't mention Riley by name. They didn't have to. Photos of his barn, blurred, cropped, anonymized, did the work for them. Neighbors who had once ignored him now crossed the street when walking their dogs. Children who had giggled at the horses from the fence line were no longer allowed near the property. One evening, Riley overheard a conversation between two joggers passing the creek, one whispering, "That's the place they're watching." There was no need to ask who they were. Fear doesn't require clarity. It only needs repetition. Riley reached out to a communications specialist he had met years ago during a nonprofit campaign. He wasn't interested in counter-propaganda. He simply wanted to understand the narrative strategy being deployed against him. The specialist reviewed the Creekstead Advocates material and confirmed Riley's suspicions. "They're running a soft disinformation loop," she said. "No lies, just questions, implications, and associations. It's hard to refute because there's nothing to directly deny. The goal isn't to convince everyone. It's to create hesitation, to plant enough discomfort that institutional actors step away from you without realizing why." When Riley asked for advice, the answer was stark. You need third-party credibility. You're too compromised now to be your own witness. Find someone the community respects and make them see you not as an outsider, but as a function. So he did. Riley contacted the regional emergency preparedness coordinator, not with a complaint, but with an invitation. He asked if they'd like to include his location in their updated asset registry as a backup distribution node for non-perishable livestock supplies during seasonal disasters. It wasn't a stretch. His setup was ideal for temporary storage and redistribution. The coordinator agreed to visit, and after a tour and documentation review, approved the inclusion, not as a binding commitment, but as a listed contingency. The listing was internal, no press release. But it meant something important. Riley's barn now had a foot in institutional legitimacy that could not be quietly erased. It became, however faintly, a component of civic function. Predictably, this only intensified the opposition. The next escalation was not about zoning or legality. It was psychological. One night, just before midnight, Riley awoke to the sound of horses agitated in their stalls. He threw on boots, grabbed his flashlight, and made his way outside. What he found stopped him cold. Someone had unlatched the outer gate, not broken it, just opened it far enough for an animal to wander. The horses had not escaped, thanks to the second interior barrier he had installed weeks earlier. But the message was clear. It wasn't vandalism. It was intrusion. Someone had walked the property while he slept. Someone had tested the edge. Riley didn't call the police. He called Jean. They sat in the barn for over an hour, saying little, both understanding that escalation had now passed a threshold. "You need cameras," Jean said finally. "I know you didn't want to, but now it's not about your privacy. It's about evidence." Riley agreed. The next day they installed motion-triggered systems. Small, unobtrusive, but thorough. They didn't point outward. They pointed inward, watching gates, fences, stall doors, access paths, not to prove guilt, but to record presence, to establish a timeline. And then, as if in response to his preparation, came the first real legal strike. A civil petition filed with the local magistrate claiming that the structure known as Barn Structure B49 was unlawfully impacting community cohesion and posed a potential hazard due to ambiguous designations. The petitioner, Karen Levington. The request was not for damages, but for injunction, to suspend operations pending review. It was a bold move, legally fragile but publicly potent. Riley received the notice with clinical detachment. He didn't panic. He forwarded it to his attorney and the municipal mediator. The review board set a hearing date, and now, for the first time, the conflict had a courtroom. Riley prepared not with drama, but with data. He compiled logs, sensor readouts, correspondence, inspection reports, and affidavits from delivery drivers, consultants, and even the emergency coordinator. He brought in the vet to testify to the animal's welfare and the barn's suitability. Jean submitted a sworn statement on the lease and land use history. And when the hearing arrived, Riley sat quietly at the table, listening as Karen's attorney made veiled references to unclassified uses, confusing filings, and inconsistent community standards. They showed a blurry drone photo with color. Overlays. They submitted neighbor testimonies describing unease, but they had no violations, no code breaches, no provable risk. When Riley's turn came, he didn't argue. He presented, not with emotion, but with authority. He walked the judge through every document. He explained each legal step taken. He highlighted the absence of any official enforcement actions. He made it clear. Every action taken had been public, traceable, and within the law. The judge listened, asked questions, and at the end issued a statement. The court finds no basis for injunction. This facility, while unconventional, is compliant with all known municipal and civic requirements. Petition denied. It was not vindication. It was survival. Karen left the courtroom without speaking, but her allies were already moving again. The next day, the Creekstead advocates issued a new bulletin. Local court denies relief. Community awareness remains essential. They were never going to stop. But Riley understood something now that changed everything. He didn't need to fight them. He needed only to exist, legally and visibly, until their accusations burned themselves out. Because narratives, like fire, require oxygen. And he had stopped giving them any. That night he fed the horses late, alone under a sky smeared with stars and silence. The barn stood solid, the land beneath it unshaken. He walked the fence line one last time, sensors quietly blinking acknowledgement as he passed. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt settled, not because the battle was over, but because he finally knew how to stand still while others lost their balance. The silence that followed the court decision was not peaceful. It was tense, hollow, the kind of quiet that fills a room after someone storms out when everyone is still waiting for the door to slam. Riley knew better than to interpret the ruling as a conclusion. Legal affirmation rarely changed the hearts of people already committed to suspicion. And so, in the days that followed the denial of Karen's injunction, he prepared, not for another lawsuit, but for a different kind of attack, the kind that avoids process entirely and instead leans on whispers, implications, and manufactured panic. The Creekstead advocates shifted their strategy almost immediately. No longer able to cite potential legal action, they pivoted toward a campaign built on safety awareness, flooding their channels with vague statements about infrastructural irregularities and long-term risk exposures. They started canvassing nearby households with printed material disguised as safety guidelines, asking questions about emergency response times and insurance rate implications. It wasn't slander, but it was carefully engineered fear-mongering, and it landed with unsettling precision among neighbors who didn't have time to investigate the facts and didn't want to feel left out of a rising consensus. One morning, Riley returned from a supply run to find a city vehicle parked at the edge of the property, orange hazard lights blinking quietly in the sunlight. 2 municipal contractors were inspecting the road shoulder, speaking into radios, occasionally pointing toward the barn. When approached, they claimed to be surveying for a proposed cable line expansion, though they had no clear documentation. Riley didn't argue, but he noted their license plate and filed a request with the city's utilities office. A week later, the office confirmed no such survey had been authorized in that area. Someone was staging presence, projecting authority without mandate, hoping Riley would either panic or violate a boundary in frustration. He didn't. Instead, he doubled down on transparency. He contacted the utility agency himself and formally requested a map of all planned service expansions in the sector, attaching a digital copy of the prior zoning records and land use designation. It wasn't to block them. It was to create a time-stamped barrier of consent and record. If they came again, he would know whether it was real or performative. Then, for nearly 2 weeks, there was nothing. No visits, no flyers, no movement. And that, more than anything, made Riley uneasy. He had learned that in this game, absence often meant coordination, like the inhaled breath before a yell. That yell came in the form of a news segment. It aired late on a Tuesday evening, buried in a regional network's human interest slot, presented with the familiar smile of a field reporter who pretended not to stir controversy while narrating the opposite. The segment was titled The Unzoned Frontier, When Residential and Resilience Collide, and though no names were mentioned, the footage was unmistakable. A drone shot of the barn, an interview with a concerned homeowner, whose face was blurred, but whose cadence and posture gave her away. Karen. The segment was careful, asking only questions. Why are these structures appearing without community vote? Should residents have a say in what's built next door? Are county systems equipped to monitor unorthodox developments? But for viewers, the message was clear. Something was wrong, and the man behind the barn wasn't going to stop. Riley didn't flinch. He expected the blow and absorbed it, responding not with outrage but with data. The next morning, he issued a public statement on a neighborhood platform, calmly laying out the full timeline of inspections, designations, and independent verifications. He linked documents, shared third-party reports, and reminded everyone that the barn was not only legal, but had been evaluated and utilized by regional civic preparedness teams. He didn't argue emotion. He offered evidence. The post received fewer comments than he expected, but the ones that did come in weren't hostile. They were curious. A few even thanked him. It wasn't victory, but it was fracture. A sign that not everyone was following the orchestrated narrative anymore. The fracture widened 3 days later when a regional fire marshal, unprompted, visited the site for a courtesy walkthrough. She had seen the segment and wanted to verify some of the claims made. Riley welcomed her, offered coffee, and walked her through every structure, every permit, every safety measure. She found nothing concerning, but what she said before leaving mattered more than any official clearance. "You've been targeted by people who don't know how to handle an outlier," she said. "Don't take it personally. Just keep being boring and lawful. Eventually, they'll exhaust themselves." Riley understood. His greatest weapon wasn't resistance. It was resilience through routine, normalcy sharpened into armor. But Karen wasn't done. Her final move was desperate and theatrical. Late one night, without warning or coordination, she erected a series of signs along her property line. Large hand-painted boards with phrases like "Warning, Zone of Undeclared Activity" and "Neighborhood at Risk, Demand Accountability." They were garish, uneven, absurd, but they weren't meaningless. The visual impact was strong. The signs appeared in photos on community pages attached to captions asking what was really happening in their quiet enclave. Riley didn't respond. He didn't retaliate. He called the city's code enforcement line and filed a complaint under visual obstruction and unpermitted signage. He attached photos and GPS coordinates. Within 72 hours, the city issued Karen a notice. Remove the signs or face fines. She removed them, but not without sending one final letter to the zoning board, requesting a reassessment of the area's civilian comfort threshold. It was rejected outright, on legal grounds and, Riley suspected, on fatigue. In the aftermath, something strange happened. The Creekstead advocates stopped posting. Their bulletin board went quiet. Their website lapsed. No announcements were made, but the silence stretched longer and longer. Karen stopped appearing on her deck. No one came to inspect. No one posted maps or speculated on heat signatures. One by one, the manufactured fears began to collapse under their own weight. And through it all, Riley remained. Not defiant, not aggressive, just consistent. The barn stood. The horses lived well. The gates stayed closed at night, and the records, as always, remained perfect. That's how conflict ends sometimes. Not with explosions or apologies, but with fatigue. The architects of chaos run out of lies. The audience loses interest. The institutions remember their limits. And the man they tried to move, to break, to pressure into submission, simply remains, quiet, prepared, unbroken. Months passed, the seasons turned, and with them, so did the neighborhood's attention. Like any prolonged campaign built on emotion and conjecture, the momentum behind the accusations against Riley eventually collapsed under its own weight. What had once been a source of speculative urgency devolved into uncomfortable silence, then indifference, and finally, absence. The barn remained exactly where it had always stood, clean, lawful, structurally sound, and unmistakably present. The horses remained calm, their routines uninterrupted. The sensors recorded fewer and fewer disturbances. Deliveries resumed regularity. Even the local zoning office, once a quiet battlefield, became little more than a distant name on envelopes Riley no longer needed to open with caution. And Karen, the driving force behind so much noise and surveillance, retreated into the margins. Her lawn was no longer pristine. Her windows remained shuttered even on sunny days. Her deck, once a sentry post of passive aggression, sat empty. She had not lost outright. No penalties, no lawsuits, but the real loss was in the erosion of her influence, her ability to rally others to a cause that no longer felt urgent. The finality of her campaign's failure wasn't marked by confrontation, but by irrelevance. Her allies fell silent, her name no longer invoked as a cautionary presence, and eventually Riley stopped seeing her altogether. He didn't celebrate. He didn't feel joy in her defeat. What he felt instead was a kind of durable clarity, the sort that only arrives after you've spent long enough watching false narratives disintegrate under the pressure of their own absurdity. For Riley, the days returned to the rhythm he had always valued: measured, grounded, quietly purposeful. He resumed the therapy program in small sessions, cautious but open. Veterans returned first, some of them drawn to the bar not because they needed the horses, but because they had heard about the fight and respected the man who had weathered it without rage or retreat. Then came the youth volunteers, eager to work, eager to learn. He kept things low profile, no signs, no social media. He didn't need to explain the barn to anyone anymore. It explained itself through its consistency. And though the ground he worked on had once been mapped and surveilled and labeled with suspicion, it was now just land again, cleared, steady, familiar. Gene renewed the lease without hesitation. He didn't raise the rate. He didn't add clauses. Instead, he came by one evening with a sealed envelope and a handshake. Inside was a handwritten note. "You kept your word. So I'll keep mine. Do what you do. Just never stop." It was the closest either of them came to acknowledging what had been endured, and it was enough. Riley placed the letter in his file drawer, next to the maps, permits, and every complaint ever filed. Not because he needed reminders of the conflict, but because he had learned that documentation is the only form of truth that survives narrative warfare. What people believe can be manipulated. What is recorded cannot. Occasionally, he still noticed odd cars pausing near the road or strangers slowing their walk when passing the gate. But the energy had changed. These were not threats. These were curiosity passing through, remnants of a story no longer being told. The barn, in the end, had outlasted the storm not because it was fortified like a bunker, but because it had been built with intention and defended with discipline. Riley never fought back with fists or outrage. He fought back by refusing to be broken, refusing to react the way his enemies needed him to, and refusing to step outside the law even when every provocation begged for it. That restraint, more than any courtroom win or bureaucratic clearance, became the architecture of his victory. He never tried to explain what happened to those who weren't involved. The truth was too strange, too incremental, too insidious to summarize. But the lesson remained, not in words, but in structure. When a system is used against you, you don't destroy it. You master it.